Okay, welcome. It's 12:10. We'll go ahead and get started. So I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Ben Turner. Dr. Turner is from Texas originally, got his bachelor's and master's there, went to South Dakota State to get a PhD in natural resources, and has worked as postdoc in New Mexico. And now he is currently part of the faculty at Texas A&M Kingsville, and he teaches classes both graduate and undergraduate there, and then also teaches courses in systems thinking as part of the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management. So Dr. Turner's research is focused more on systems approach and how we can use systems analysis and natural resource management. And that is what he will be talking about today. So I will get out of the way and turn the rest of the time over to him.
Well, thank you all for joining us here this afternoon, and to Dr. Frost for the invitation to be a part of this seminar series. In putting this together for this seminar with you, Dr. Frost asked that I talk about the work that we've done using what we call systems thinking or a systems approach to natural resource management. And so I'll do as an efficient job as I can to walk through a couple of case studies with you after introducing a little bit of rationale and motivation for this sort of approach in our fields. So let me jump in here if I can.
Is it not working now? Well, that's no fun.
You need to click on that.
No, he's got my,
Yeah, but I was
You're right.
the mouse is on.
So Dr. Frost mentioned a little bit of my background, really what my interest was as a student, and to get me to on the path of trajectory career-wise, was interested in ranch management, and so kind of prioritized that as a student and as a research area for me, and soil and watershed conservation, and a little bit into rangeland ecosystems, although with my background and some of the places I've been and programs I've been a part of, I'm not really a ranch manager. I'm not really a rangeland ecologist. I'm not really a hydrologist, but I integrate and pick up on a lot of the tools and techniques and concepts from all these areas to apply to problems of interest. For the systems thinking component that Dr. Frost mentioned, teaching systems thinking in our program at Texas A&M University-Kingsville. Since 2017, I've been a part of teaching our King Ranch Institute for Range Management lectureship in systems thinking. And I'll take a little bit about the Institute here in just a moment. But that is the actually the oldest lectureship program in the King Ranch Institute program. It's the flagship lectureship that kind of the curriculum is based around, and then efforts to support that as well. Over $1 million for systems thinking in higher education, and I'm happy to share details about that for especially the faculty that might have an interest to know more about that. And then again, as much for the faculty, the references about any sort of background material that I might reference here. I'll highlight a couple of case studies later, but I kind of give a breakdown of what we've produced through our groups using systems thinking and system dynamics as a framework to address some of the issues we care about in ranch management and soil and water conservation and rangeland conservation. A little bit about the King Ranch Institute for Range Management. It was started in 2003 to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the founding of King Ranch in South Texas. And the vision is to sustain our ranching heritage through education, innovation, and outreach. And just a little bit about the numbers in terms of the students. There's over 50 alumni. If you do the math, that's the alumni across the country that have graduated from the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management program. Collectively, those alumni manage 9 million acres of ranch land and wildlife habitat, over 190,000 head of breeding cows, 1,250 horses, over 800 employees. And then through our outreach and education events, which the Systems Thinking Lectureship is a part of, but there's a whole curriculum and curriculum of lectureships that are hosted over the years, over 140 of those to over 8,000 individuals across 42 states and 7 countries. And through our partnership with Texas Farm Credit, there's a certificate program for those that want to go through our outreach and education events that may not have time for a full graduate program. And this is a dated number now, it's well over 250 in terms of those certificate recipients. So just a little bit about our institute and kind of who we serve there and where they're at now. The outline for the rest of my talk, if I can get there as sufficiently as possible, is to give you a little bit of background in systems thinking and why systems thinking in agriculture and natural resource management. I'll give a little bit into the theory underlying the systems approach there, and then move into some case studies. Maybe not the two that Dr. Frost and I originally talked about, but these were the two more interesting ones I thought about as I prepared. One on bovine respiratory disease and one on early weaning and an integrated system, and then just wrap up with some final comments. So why systems thinking in agriculture and natural resource management? Well, as scientists in the day and age that we live, we take advantage of the scientific method and the tools and technology that it has unleashed for us to learn as much about the observable world as we might have ever known, and to employ that to ends that make our society and the world around us hopefully a better place. And that's driven by experiments designed to measure, observe, right, and test those things that we see out there in the real world that we want to learn something about. And we use the scientific method of reduction, repetition, and find the refutation to discard those theories or those ideas or those relationships that may not be true. And so through this scientific method of reduction and breaking down our observations about the world, our society, and our scientific journey as a society has been to separate the world around us into many different disciplines or many different silos. And I'll highlight some of these here, from physics, chemistry, biology, ecology, science, livestock, wildlife, crops, ag econ, philosophy, policy, law, theology, philosophy, so on and so forth. And so we broke it down, pieces of our world, to understand it better into these silos, disciplines, to help us try to understand and unpack the world around us. Unfortunately for us that are in natural resource management, ranch management, ecology, things may not be so simple as that siloed approach. The complexity of our systems that we're dealing with in the real world and how things interact may not be so conducive to putting into that reductionist silo and understanding it from one piece. So here's the picture, ranch situation. You can see the livestock out. And if you think about those silos that we just looked at, we can start to see there's many overlapping silos here that might be at work in even just this grazing situation. Biology, chemistry, and physics, and what that means for the animals themselves, the soils, the crops, the livestock, what the animals mean from an economic standpoint and generating costs, or being a profit center or revenue center, how policy might influence what we do on the landscape or how we interact with the market, how climate might impact all of these things. And management sits at this crux because management is managing all these pieces in concert with one another. And if that were complicated enough in the real world as ecologists, there's feedback between all these other elements, because if one thing is consuming one thing, it might be leaving an impact behind. If we're marketing in one area, that's going to change the market, and that's going to influence future decisions as well. And so it's not so quite a simple picture as that silo that we just mentioned. But because of that scientific journey that we've been on over the past centuries as a society and as land-grant institutions more recently, we've fallen into, or some have argued, and I would argue to a certain extent, fallen into a siloed effect in our world and how we view problems. So what are some potential silos in ranch management that we might find ourselves falling into? Well, it might be a silo of range management, livestock, wildlife, human resource management. The list could go on. But these are silos in isolation of one another. And what one of my mentors, Barry Dunn, argued, and what I'm showing you here, is that the systems approach to ranch management is really about cross-functional management. How do we put all the pieces together to work cooperatively or adaptively manage the whole ranch or the whole watershed or the whole system to exceed, the performance exceeds the sum of their parts. So, so we call this endeavor to try to put those pieces together, this systems thinking approach. So this is an approach, recognize and diagnose, manage complex problems. Systems thinking is also a suite of tools, and I'll kind of unpack a little bit of that in just a moment. The tools that we use to understand, visualize, and test the relationships that we're trying to understand better. And then finally, it's a mental model that tries to appreciate in a richer way the complexity of all those interactions I showed in that picture just a moment ago. It's the forage, it's the soils, it's the environment, it's the watersheds, policy, management, all the feedbacks between those things. How do we do a better job of recognizing and appreciating those relationships? So I view the systems thinking, it is an approach. There are some tools in our toolbox that help us do that. But those tools are best utilized if we're cultivating within ourselves the own mental model, the paradigm, the perspective to view and try to unpack the world in this particular kind of way. So what do ranch managers need to know? They may not be the user or the adopter of these tools, but they are certainly in the best place for the world that we care about in natural resource management and ranch management to already have some intuition and some appreciation for that mental model that I just mentioned. All right. So the way I view what ranch managers need to know is, can we equip them and provide for them some tools, some resources, some case studies, some models potentially that helps them refine and cultivate their intuition about the relationships they're seeing on the ground. And so how do we communicate that? How do we test that? And as I just mentioned, I think the best way that I can do that, and for faculty like faculty here at Montana State can do that, we do that in thinking aids, models, decision tools, and case studies that we can deploy. And I'll share a couple of those with you in just a few moments. Before I get into the actual cases, a little bit about where this perspective has come from and what kind of the underlying theory is that we're working on. So the discipline of systems that I come from, founder of this field, is a gentleman by the name of J.W. Forster. And he spent his entire career at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He was an engineer by training and did some remarkable things. I don't have time to unpack a lot of the contributions and things that he did. But for us in this room, why I think it's a unique person to get to know is because J.W. Forster was born and raised on a ranch in the Sandhills of Nebraska that his parents had homesteaded. And in some of his writings, he mentions growing up on the ranch and building that appreciation for complexity because he saw how watershed functions, the plant community functions, the livestock, how their livelihood depended on the market, so on and so forth. And so he wrote about that, and that started to build this foundation that we call systems thinking and system dynamics. Some of the people that he mentored, most of their literature is kind of sort of in the business world, not the natural resource management world. But Peter Singay, The Fifth Discipline, John Sturman, Business Dynamics, Barry Richmond, who is an innovator with some of the tools that we use in terms of computer simulation to unpack these systems. And then a good friend of mine and mentor, Mike Goodman, who's been in the consulting world for decades and decades. It's been helping to teach and proliferate this kind of perspective. And then kind of the next generation, and I warned this person they might get a call out, kind of the next generation of system dynamicists are folks like Nelson Repenning at MIT, another colleague of mine, Rogelio Oliva at Texas A&M and College Station, and your very own Dr. Laura Black here at Montana State. And I cannot tell you how honored and humbled I am that she would come and view this seminar and what lowly work I may be doing in systems for ranch management, because when I tell you that she is a pillar in this field, she is a pillar in this field, the respect and recognition that she has. So I just want you to know how honored I am that you would come as a fellow system dynamicist that would be here to watch this. So thank you so much for joining us. So that's what I would call mainline system dynamics and or systems thinking. And so where does this line that for natural resource management come in? There are several influential people that I want to recognize, and one is Richard Bogdan, and for my money, from what I can tell, developed the first agricultural systems-based program anywhere in the world. He was a faculty in Australia and developed an agricultural program based on these ideas and principles back in the 1980s, and wrote remarkably on some of the things that I'll unpack later with these case studies that definitely come from what he envisioned. Another person I've been fortunate to work with is William Grant from Texas A&M, who was a rangeland ecologist, actually by training. And he read and got a hold of Barry Richmond's Introduction to Stella, and that changed his world. He later became very influential in the ecological modeling world, and I've been fortunate to see his work and get to know and interact with him. And he's written like at least a half dozen books on applying this in rangeland settings, wildlife populations, watershed management, and so on and so forth. Then in the 1990s, one of my mentors, Barry Dunn, who was a rancher in South Dakota, shifted career gears for him and his situation, and actually went to MIT to do some of the executive training in system dynamics and learned from Jay Forrester and John Sturman, and got hooked up with our friend Mike Goodman, and took the toolbox that he got and became the first executive director of the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management. So that's more directly where I come in. And then one more connection is one of my mentors, who was a mentor to me at the master's level and PhD level. It was Luis Tedeschi, who's an animal scientist, who was just so happened to be at Cornell University in the 1990s for his PhD. And at that time, a gentleman by the name of Alan Borstein, who was a student of J.W. Forrester's, had set up a fellowship program that students at Cornell can learn systems. One of those people happened to be Dr. Luis Tedeschi, who became one of my mentors with Barry Dunn. And when I tell you that Luis Tedeschi is one of the top, maybe the top in the world, but certainly top 5 in the world in terms of nutrition models, that's the guy. And he uses system dynamics as part of his toolbox. So all of that informs these cases that I'll share and the kind of what's in the toolbox here that comes from this. But I wanted to recognize the people that I've had the advantage to learn from and start to apply this. A little bit of the theory underlying this, and then I will promise to move to the case studies. What are some things that we say from the systems world about the observations, the relationships, the behaviors about complex systems that we see in the real world? Well, there's kind of, we can boil this down to 4 or 5 or 6 characteristics. I'll boil them down to 5. We say that things are tightly coupled. Everything influences everything else. We say that systems and real world problems are dynamic, that change occurs across many, many different timescales. Some may be days, some may be weeks, some may be months, some may be years, some may be decades, some may be even centuries in terms of how they express themselves. Systems tend to be, and problems tend to be counterintuitive. That meaning that cause and effect are distant in time and space. That means something that I do here now can influence something that you do over there later, and vice versa. Right? That we're not disconnected, even though we might be in different places, making decisions at different times. We say that systems and problems tend to be policy resistant, that obvious solutions often fail or make things worse. The harder we push, the harder the system pushes back. And the reason for that is within the systems that we manage, there's a principle called compensating feedback. And those are often the things that we don't think about in the moment, but they're part of the system that come back and push back against our decisions. And then finally, these problems exhibit trade-offs. What works in the short term often makes things worse in the long term and vice versa. So because of these sorts of relationships that we see in the world around us, complex systems like ranches, like watersheds, like landscapes can do some very interesting things. They tend to self-organize in ways that produce emergent properties that are history or path dependent. That means we know something about their history, trajectory, we have the information about it, where it comes from, can maybe forecast a little bit about where it's going, but despite that can still produce endogenously surprise behaviors that we can't anticipate and that we can't always foresee in advance. And so because of those behaviors that these complex systems like ranches, like watersheds, like organizations, all these features conspire against that reductionist mode, that siloed mode before, which is we tend to simplify and decouple different factors and what may be happening into their individual component parts. We tend to linearize and look for ways to optimize certain things regardless of what timescales or interactions may be really the root cause of things. We tend to have a perspective of cause and effects that are short-term and proximate in nature. And I'll give you one good example on the BRD example here in just a moment. Maybe that one. We tend to favor policy prescriptions without respect for the latent yet powerful compensating feedbacks that are at work that we don't take the time necessarily to unpack and appreciate. And then finally, we tend to seek solutions. How do we solve this problem over management? And then again, think about if you hold that picture in your head a moment ago of the livestock grazing, that particular site, and all the feedbacks that are at work right there. And such a system that has those trade-offs and have effects that are happening at different timescales and different trade-offs and all those things, problems and management is never really solved, they're only managed. Right, so that's one of the things I'd like to just underline there. Now into some tools from linear to systems thinking and how we help our students at A&M Kingsville in the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management start to take those things, like I just mentioned, some of these characteristics and relationships that express themselves in the systems that we're managing. How do we start to build the mindset, the mental model, cultivate that appreciation for complexity of the world around us? And so one of the staple classic examples in our discipline is the iceberg diagram. And this is really a thinking aid and a thinking process to help us slow down and maybe appreciate what's going on at maybe a deeper level than we were before. Because under the surface, what may be there influencing the situation may not be apparent immediately, but upon some reflection and upon some investigation, we might get below the surface down here to the bottom of the iceberg where maybe more of the mass is happening there. And so we say those things that are at the surface level that we can see and observe in our day-to-day observations with our five senses, we call those things events. And we tend to react and firefight to those things. So those are emergencies. These are fighting fires. These are crises that we didn't expect to do today. We didn't expect to put that fire out today, or to fix that fence today, or to fix that water today. But this emergency came up, and I've got to react to that. That's one level of awareness. One level of focus is the event level awareness, the event level focus. The next level, if we go a little bit deeper, are trends and patterns. And this is what's been happening over time, say over the past year, or the past number of years, or the past decade, depending on the problem that may be going on. And if we can do some due diligence and understand what's been happening over time, historically, we might be able to anticipate and forecast a little bit where that system may be going, and how problematic it may actually be, and how much worse it might become, and how we might anticipate where it's going, so we can start to mitigate and hedge against that. That's kind of the second layer of awareness or focus. But deeper down than that is the structural level of awareness, or the structural level of focus. And these are on the feedbacks, the forces, and pressures that give rise to trends and patterns and crises that we have to manage in our day-to-day operations. If we get to the structural level of awareness, the structural level of focus, this is where we can start to change and create the behaviors that we would like to see. Because now we're working on the system, not working against the system. We're working on the business rather than working in the business. We're working, instead of firefighting or trying to manage a relationship, we're actually working on the relationship at the structural level of awareness and focus. And we say structure drives behavior and performance in these systems. That's what gives rise to trends and patterns and events. So we tell our students with this framework, we want to admire the problems before we jump to some kind of management intervention or management option that we're going to implement. And so to do that, we have them walk down this iceberg idea, this iceberg framework, that ask and answer for themselves about the problem that we're working on. What happened? What's been happening? And then finally try to do our best to unpack why those things have been happening. Why is it that the structure is the way that it is that gives rise to these behaviors that are of interest? If we get down to the structural level, that's where the deeper learning and leverage can take place. There's very little leverage in the reaction and firefighting, the day-to-day crises to be put out. There is leverage there. We can leverage that to a certain extent, but we would rather have higher leverage at the structural level so that we don't produce as many fires, we don't produce as many breaks, we don't produce as many crises over time. So, structure drives behavior, and the bottom line of this whole systems approach that I've been advocating for so far is that behaviors in these systems, branches, farms, watersheds, landscapes, their behaviors arise from their endogenous feedback structures. The building blocks we use to describe structure are stocks and flows for the simulation component, and I might share an example of that. Reinforcing and balancing processes, and I gave a handout that illustrates part of that, and the decision rules and policies that influence the flows and feedbacks. And those are our mental models about how we make decisions. What data do we look at when we make decisions? What are the goals that we're responding to? What are the incentives that we're responding to? That's the soft qualitative stuff down here that drives our decision making and behaviors that we definitely have to consider. Okay, so with all that framework there, let me jump into some actual cases here in the last few minutes here. We'll certainly get through one, may not get through the other one, just due to a time constraint as I watch the time go a little bit. Here's the list, and I gave the list of references out there for anyone, mostly the faculty, that might want to learn more about how this has been applied in other places or how they might apply it to their own problems for the students. Icing on the cake if you really want to dive into one of the issues there. But the ones that I'm going to unpack here are bovine respiratory disease and stocker cattle enterprises, and then time permitting, the early weaning case there. So this case study comes from a group that is a very dynamic group. It's called Veterinarian Advancement of Systems Thinking. It's a group that I've been privileged to be a part of, not quite since its inception, but pretty close to that. And it's a very dynamic group of veterinarians who have observed some of these features that I've tried to outline in their practices as veterinarians, helping livestock operators, helping ranchers. And so really the drivers of this case study are Dr. Dan Cummings and Dr. John Groves, and then I just help facilitate putting some of the pieces together here. So a little bit about bovine respiratory disease. It's a multifactorial disease complex, observed with fever, pneumonia-like symptoms, impacts all ages and classes and breeds. There's evidence of rising bovine respiratory disease incidence over time. I'll show you some data for. It's an increasing source of management frustration, and this is part of their rationale or their motivation. Doctors Cummings and Dr. Groves, given their frustration with management and the results that they were seeing, and of course, there's significant economic losses in the production supply chain due to value losses. So, using that iceberg diagram framework, I just want to walk through a little bit about this case. So, some events associated with BRD, like my veterinary colleagues, despite efforts to understand and manage and intervene in this disease, such as pharmaceutical interventions, improved nutrition, preconditioning programs, the stocker industry continues to be plagued with high occurrences of BRD. And BRD challenges, induced challenges influence stocker operations and often might be one of the culprits for conflict among team members in the ranch organization. Here's some data that helps us point to this. This is actual feeder cattle mortality. So it's not exactly BRD, but BRD is a morbidity case prior to mortality. So it's not exactly one-to-one, but it does give some indication about morbidity risk in cattle entering the feedlot. And this is data out of Kansas, 1995 to just last year. And you can see the behavior there for yourself, steers and heifers, mortality rate. And so working with Dr. Cummings and Dr. Groves, we kind of transferred this to think about what BRD might look like, morbidity over time, given the data that we've seen in the supply chain and the operations that they're working with. And so we kind of sketched out their mental model, their experience of what they've seen. And so what you see here is that morbidity increases sharply with sharp declines. And what we see with that, when we think about what's happening with management, is when the crisis breaks out, when the pressure is on, it gets attention, it gets focus, and it gets resources to do something about. And in the short term, that might provide some relief. Longer term, the problem is still escalating. The problem is still occurring. What we've intervened has only been short term in nature. So we wanted to dive into, with those trends and patterns, what might be the underlying structure in these stocker cattle enterprises that might be contributing to that. So I won't go through mechanically all the language things here, but I did provide on the handout a little bit about reinforcing and balancing processes. I'll just save that for reference and I'll tell you the story. All right, the story is that as bovine respiratory disease becomes problematic, operators tend to rely on their antimicrobial use in their populations to try to contain that. And in the short term, that reduces their BRD pressure. In the longer term, what the operators struggle with, but recognize would be a longer term solution to BRD, is can we devote more resources to process improvement in terms of how we source cattle, where we source cattle, the processing culture around those cattle, how they flow through our part of the value chain. How do we improve all of those pieces that if we get those pieces better organized, would be a process improvement that would also address BRD, maybe at a different level than antimicrobial use. But working with these managers, what sets in is that if they use antimicrobial use, they can maintain productivity at their current levels without changing anything or changing not very much. So their growth goals continue to be met and they remain competitive in the marketplace because they're maintaining size and scale of operations. They're generating a return on investment for themselves, and that validates their current actions because financially they're seeing it's worthwhile. I can continue to do that. Well, when they're validated with their current actions, that maybe doesn't allow them to see opportunities to invest in resources where they can improve the actual process of what their operation looks like. So unintentionally, antimicrobial use may be thwarting their longer term goals and efforts to alleviate the root issue for them for bovine respiratory disease. In addition, with return on investment in the value chain, there's less recognition of shared vision needed to make those process improvements because they're sourcing cattle from certain auctions, they're sourcing cattle from certain growers at certain times of the year. And if those operations are making money and my operation continues to make money, then there's less shared vision for process improvement, which then again thwarts their efforts unintentionally, not because they want to, but devotes less effort and attention to how they might improve that process. This is a behavior known as shifting the burden, because over time, in the long run, we're confronted with several different options. We can use a short-term treatment. We can devote attention and resources to a longer-term structural intervention. The longer or the more we push on the short-term intervention, the burden of managing that problem gets shifted solely to the short term. Forget about the long-term effort that might take longer, but address the root cause of the situation. Even deeper than that, I'm just telling you kind of the story here. Even deeper than that are the mental models that drive those decisions and behaviors. So what are some mental models that underlie some of these decisions here? So with antimicrobial use, it's fast, it's convenient, it doesn't disrupt my production system. I can easily integrate that. It's already part of my process. So we can handle that, no problem. Market competitiveness. I'm keeping my size and scale and productivity up, and I'm competitive in my region, in my market. Well, if I'm maintaining that, that's going to keep me competitive. I don't want my supply going somewhere else in the market. Return on investment. If I don't make money now, I won't be in business later. Again, underlying goals and motivations here. Validation of current results. I'm rewarded by shareholders, customers, and suppliers for using best management practices. If this is kind of where the industry says we can go, and that's one of the practices we're going to promote, well, then that also reinforces that validation. Recognition of shared vision for process improvement. We all know it's a problem, but because of the segmented nature of the industry, the incentives and the finances that we've all invested in and trying to make all those operations financially viable, we all know it's a problem, but we're all acting reasonably towards our own goals as part of the system. Or the operations in the beef production system that we share. All of those things might thwart, and what we argue in the paper is thwarting resources devoted to process improvement. We simply can't devote the time and the energy and the money right now. It's too much that has to change. It'll be too disruptive. So we don't want to slow things down. We don't want to put a wrench in the gears. We don't want to really critically evaluate what we might do there when all this other stuff takes priority. It takes the precedence there. So lessons for leverage, feedback-based use, illustrate in this case how standardizing that use, antimicrobial use, may unintentionally align firm resources to take advantage of industry relationships and structure, diverting attention and resources away from progress on root causes. Current BRD research is often short-term and proximate because the unit of study typically is the individual animal or cohorts of animals to understand disease dynamics and pathogenicity and marketing stress, so commingling, transportation, nutrition from point A to point B, etc., rather than the unit of study being the risk profile and health of the system. If you agree with the chart I showed earlier with the cyclicity, but also the increase in morbidity and mortality, well, then there's something going on in the system-wide level that we quite really not quite have gotten our hands around yet. So possible leverage points here to think about in the BRD case. Develop process-based interventions and leading indicators at the system level rather than the individual animal or cohort level. And some of these things I've just listed out. We mentioned them in the paper that I cited here. And just literally for those that read stuff from Beef Magazine and some of the industry online periodicals, just about 1 month ago, my colleague John Groves had a part of this case study in those. I'd be happy to dig that up and share that with you. And we talk about some of these things. So industry genetic traits. Part of that's economic, but part of that's also cultural and operational at the industry level. What's not in the case study, but it's just an anecdote. There's a large-scale stocker operation in South Texas. They source cattle from East Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, and they'll go through, or they'll probably graze out before finishing, sending off to finish 25, 30 something head per year, their grazing season. And one of their guys said to me something about the death loss, sick loss and death loss that they had this year, which was particularly significant. And when I talked to the manager about it, this was just him spitballing, but he was saying, we've been doing this, it's been our operation for years. There's something happening with these livestock that just aren't as hardy anymore. We're pushing on some genetic levers that have some of these consequences. I'm paraphrasing, but we're pushing on some levers that they don't hold up as much anymore. We're prioritizing some traits over others that we don't totally understand. Procurement source, reputation, and process, cultural and personal. Where do they come from? How are they managed? Why were they managed that way that makes them high-risk cattle? And how can we get to that point rather than fighting the fire at the stocker or the feedlot level? That regionalization goes into part of a lot that's been looked at shipping already. I think some really interesting stuff that my colleague John Groves has worked on is processing culture and ways to not overturn the whole shipping process and cattle processing procedure, but ways to do empty pen rotations and reverse quarantines to take advantage of some structural things we can do with smaller pen sizes and where cattle go through the system that might minimize that. And then one that's kind of an emergent one, precision technology that might see animal or cohort or system level indicators maybe before we can see them or they express themselves elsewhere. And then finally, just raising awareness of organizational effort on those things, which is what our paper was about. To think about what are those compensating feedbacks that I showed you just a moment ago that thwart effort to get to the longer term management interventions. Okay, there's another case, but I'm looking at the clock there, and that's right before the hour. So what I will do is stop there and just go to, let's see. So let me click through as quickly as I'd like and just click through that case and similar thing there with the iceberg. So as I mentioned, we all utilize the scientific process and the tools and technology that it's unleashed to understand the world around us and to make it better. Unfortunately, those efforts are thwarted when we're dealing with problems and relationships with increasing orders of complexity, like management of farms, management of ranches, watershed conservation, and social issues, for example. So system sciences, which I try to advocate for here, I give you just a little glimpse of. Those are efforts to cross-cut those problems and put the pieces together. Because like the VRD problem, it's not just a disease problem. It's a cattle flow problem. It's a cultural problem. It's a genetic problem. It's an economic problem. It cross-cuts all those things. So how do we put the pieces together to get to a deeper understanding and deeper rooted intervention to better manage that? So my take-home message: admire the problem, make your thinking explicit on why we do what we do, not just the technical hands-on aspects of it, but why do we do it that way? Hunt out the compensating feedbacks that may not be so evident at the surface, but are as real as the things that we see at the surface level. Cultivate an appreciation of complexity, and then with that appreciation, act and change the world through your management, but maybe at a different level of awareness and focus. So that's my take-home message there. So we may be out of time, and I apologize for that, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here and share just a glimpse of what this approach is and how we use it. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Frost if you have time for any discussion.
Yeah, thank you. We can take just a couple of minutes for questions if you have any for Dr. Turner this time.
Yes.
Is there a way in your mind to kind of incentivize those system changes for the short term? And like with the BRD example, as opposed to antimicrobial use, is there a way to kind of incentivize a shift towards that base level systems changes rather than the short term solution to address these problems? Or
Is there a way to shift that? I think there are let me unpack this a little bit. At the personal level, that's already happening, like my colleagues John Groves and Dan Cummings and our VAST group. This is one of their real hot button issues that they're trying to cultivate with industry stakeholders. How do we get a better handle on this? So that's kind of a personal level. And if we ever achieve that, that would be more at the industry level. I want to also answer your question in another way, unrelated to that case, but more to what you're talking about. How do we, in day-to-day management, do that? And I had a student just this semester ask me something very similar about, he was a ranch manager, he's in our program, he's going to go back and manage ranches, and he asked me something very similar. And I think if we cultivate this, and if we really pay attention to it, and we really strive to communicate it well, what we're thinking and what the issues are, then I think that will naturally happen. his question was very similar, how do we shift from the short term to the long term? And he was asking me, how do we stop from all the firefighting that I did at the ranch? When I go back, I don't want to firefight like I did. That's a headache. It's a mess. How do we do that? And I said, part of my answer is, if you're a manager, if you're in this situation, if you practice that appreciation of complexity and you're trying to unpack some of these relationships which I showed in that case, then you will change how you communicate the issues. You will change how you might give instruction. You will change how you assign certain tasks, right? Because you're starting to, in your mind's eye, in your mental model, if you're starting to see and appreciate what I've shown on the screen there for that case, then you start to anticipate and your intuition about those relationships improves. And when that intuition and that understanding improves, you're not going to do the things that you used to do. You're not going to do them in the same way that you used to do them, right? So naturally, you're going to start to shift from that short term down towards the bottom, what I showed you, towards the longer term, right? So it's not easy. It takes hard work. It takes a lot of thought and energy to try to unpack it. But after seeing like this case, and I didn't have time to get to the other case, which maybe I should, maybe that would have been a better show. It absolutely can be done, because the other case I had to show is where same process that I showed you here, large scale bean cattle operation, absolutely took this. They had a significant issue with their heifers and their reproductive efficiency for their heifer unit and the cascading effects across their entire operation. And we use this approach to improve their intuition and improve how they kind of sequence things. And the results have been dramatic. But they have been willing to invest in thinking about it to try to get there, right? And so that's my longer way to get you a question. If you're willing to think about it and you're willing to do the hard work to unpack it and work really hard at communicating it, you're not going to do the same things you used to. You're not going to do them in the same way. So things will start to change. Do that. Next one. And then we have time.
What kind of like incentives would be implemented at the industry level, do they, to reduce the use of the environmental fuels?
Nobody knows where the threshold is yet because we haven't hit the threshold, but there is going potentially a big financial incentive. We just haven't hit that yet because the other gains in yield and quality have been so great, are pushing on that genetic lever. The industry has responded to the market in terms of quality. And so we have hit those for sure. Right? If the BRD case continues to escalate at the rate that it is, there's going to be some other financial feedbacks that hit at different segments, right? That will force that conversation, but we haven't hit that, whatever that financial threshold is in each sector, we haven't quite hit that yet. And part of that is because we've overcome those losses because our productivity quality has increased so quickly over these years. So there's that financial part. There's part of that's market, although it will take longer to kind of unpack that. And then I think the jury is still out on the work like my colleague John Groves and what they're doing with trying to innovate. So they've got John Groves, for example, he has a portfolio of producers that he works with. He's in Missouri, and they're doing real world management interventions of some of the things that that I mentioned here. And the jury is still out because they're still getting data and all that. But that's more the personal level because they're doing it for themselves, not for the industry level, but they're doing it for themselves because they see the toll it takes on their operation. Is everybody else in the industry willing to do that yet? Maybe we're not there yet, but the needle is starting to move with efforts like that.
I think my question's similar, but maybe more on like research like in your case study, there were, several potential influences in what's contributing to this bigger problem within the system. But like those influences themselves are a little bit siloed, like the genetics or the processing, that sort of a thing. So like, how do you continue to like be able to research those specific questions, those influences, while still like, so like you still kind of have this silo, but then you still need to be able to keep the big picture in mind. Like, how do you collaborate within sort of siloed research? Like, you need the people with the genetic expertise to start answering those questions for you, but then still keep the big picture and that collaboration and that bigger system in mind. Like, how do you mix those?
This confirms in my mind I should have gone with the second case. So for research and this kind of approach for research and not, taking advantage of, we have great information in certain disciplines and certain silos. Our approach doesn't do away with it. We leverage those insights and that knowledge in how we put our models together of the big picture. And so, for example, for the second case, which I clearly should have used now, was the heifer fertility, a reproductive efficiency problem on this large scale operation. And researchers in that area, animal scientists, had the data, had the information about particular recovery for a first cast heifer. After her recovery, right, what those parameters were that would get her cycling again and how successful she would be on her second breeding season. Had all the data. No producers in that region had implemented that or really taken advantage of that. It was against kind of the belief system. So when we worked with that ranch, they're scratching their heads because culturally nobody's doing that in that area, in that region of the country. But the scientists had the data on what the recovery would be and the productive performance would be given certain production practices. So we built that into the model of their operation. And so we used that as a potential test. We got some really positive results. They've implemented those results. And as I said, their real world results now speak for themselves. And they're going against the grain of everybody in that part of the country. So we don't do away, long way to answer. We don't do away with that scientific siloed information. We leverage that to help us put the pieces together. And I wish I had showed the other model, but you can see how that all comes together.
So we'll hold for time now, but of course, grad students, you have him for lunch. Maybe you can talk him into showing that next model during lunch if you're really curious about, or at least talking through it here. But thank you everyone for attending. Appreciate it. If you have other questions. Yeah, there's more time. And it's also available to visit with students. It says ranching systems, any students are welcome, anyone at 3 o'clock and 1:45 as well. So.
That's okay. TA, that's